I also have a very loud voice, but if you really can't hear me, please do tell me so. Use the mic? Okay. Now I got both hands full. She said just push this button and the green light would light, but now it's not lighting. Is this on? No. Thank you, Bethany. It's on? Can you hear me now? Oh my goodness. That's scary. Okay. When I first started, oh yes, I have to talk into it, don't I? When I first started to plan this talk, which I originally gave 2.5 years ago at the Babcock-Smith House, I thought that what I would be talking about would be the original settlers of Westerly, who they were, where they came from, and what their lives were like. I did not expect to talk about the Native Indians very much, and I definitely did not expect to talk about the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But oh boy, it turned out to be a lot about both of those. So today I'm going to talk about 7 things. This is scary. First, I will talk about the tribes who were here in the area of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Then I will talk about the first settlements of New England in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Then I will talk about the very beginnings of Westerly, the first people who came and why. And then I will talk about the incorporation in 1669 and who the inhabitants were at that time. Then I'll talk about the Massachusetts and Connecticut land claims, which is a very interesting story. Then King Philip's War, which is an incredible event. And then I will talk about the daily lives of the settlers and what their world was like. I put this in here to show you just how many monarchs there were in England in the period of the settlements here in New England. There were many different kings and a time of great confusion because, as you can see, it involved the time of the Cromwells and the Protectorate as well. And so for these people here, every time they wanted to get permission to do something or inquire about something from the king, who was the absolute ruler of the colonies, they'd go over there and it would be a different king with different ideas and ways of doing things, which created a lot of serious problems for the people in New England. Okay, sorry. This shows a little bit about who those tribes were and where they were. Over here, near Plymouth, are the Wampanoag Indians. And when the Pilgrims landed in 1620 in Plymouth, the Wampanoag Indians actually greeted them and were very helpful to them. So they were in that area. Over here in Rhode Island, as you know, were the Narragansett Indians. And over in Connecticut were the Pequots. But by the time Westerly was settled, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had completely wiped out the Pequots. They burned the fort over in Mystic back in 1637. And there is a very graphic film about that over at the Pequot Museum. If you haven't been to the Pequot Museum, go. It's a fabulous museum. Down here along the coast were the Niantic Indians. The West Niantic Indians were roughly between New London and the Connecticut River. And the East Niantics were here in the Westerly South County area. Now, in the Plymouth area was this Wampanoag tribe who greeted the Pilgrims when they came. The sachem at the time of 1620, when the Pilgrims landed, was a man named Massasoit, who died in 1661, actually the year the first settlers came to Westerly, of old age. But when the Pilgrims first came, he was good to them. He offered to sell them land, both to have peace with them and to get trade goods. The Indians would trade with the colonists for goods from Europe and so forth. Massasoit had 2 sons. His first son was named Wamsutta, and the younger son was named Metacom. If I am mispronouncing these Indian names, I apologize. Many of them I've only read, I've never heard them pronounced. So after Massasoit died, Wamsutta became the sachem, and then when he died, Metacom became the sachem. when the settlers in Plymouth were still treating the Wampanoags with some respect, the people in Plymouth actually gave honorary names to Wamsutta and Metacom, and they named him after the two great kings of Macedonia, King Alexander and King Philip. One of the people in that Wampanoag tribe, Squanto, was very important to the Pilgrims. As you probably know, a year after the Pilgrims landed, only half of the original group was alive. They had a very rough year. And Squanto taught them a great many survival skills to live in these primitive woods where they had landed. In Rhode Island, of course, was the Narragansett tribe. And the Narragansett tribe actually had 30,000 people at its height, and they could field 5,000 warriors. Is this echoing too much, or is it okay? Okay.
There is a persistent low hum of feedback. Perhaps if you turn down the volume on the microphone, that would go away.
I have no idea how to do that.
No, it's not on your system, the sound system, not the microphone.
Oh, okay. I don't know. I don't know how to do that. Thank you. One thing I forgot to mention was if you have any questions, I would appreciate it if you'd hold them till the end, and then I'd be glad to address questions. And also, while I'm interrupting myself, I'd like to thank my friend and fellow docent, Jan Tunney, who actually prepared these slides for me 3 years ago and has revived them again for me this time. So thank you, Jan. Okay. In the Narragansett tribe, when the people first came to Rhode Island, the Roger Williams crowd, Canonicus became a friend to Roger Williams, and they treated each other with mutual respect. And then when he died, Miantanomi became the sachem of the Narragansett tribe, and as you can see, he was eventually killed by the Massachusetts Bay people. And then Cananshit, the younger son, became the sachem, and he died in the Great Swamp Fight, which we'll talk about later. The Niantic Indians, who were here in the Westerly area, were actually a sub-tribe of the Narragansetts, and their sachem was a man named Ninigret. He's the Indian who's in the statue down in Watch Hill. And Ninigret befriended the people who came here and was good to them. And he was a young man when they first came here. He didn't die till 1722. And his ties to the Narragansett tribe were increased by the fact that his sister was married to one of the sons of the sachem Canonicus. The Pequot tribe, who had been, as you know, over in eastern Connecticut, were actually completely destroyed by the Massachusetts Bay Colony. I mean, there were a few survivors, but as a tribe, as an entity, they were destroyed by Massachusetts Bay in 1637. Before any settlers came to New England, there was a huge epidemic that killed a great many of the Indians here, except the Narragansetts, who weren't really along the coast. The Niantics were, but many Indians were killed. It was probably something like smallpox, and probably brought to them by the traders, because the Dutch were coming up to this area to trade with the Indians from New Netherlands long before this New England was settled. And they would actually trade with the Indians right on the beach. The Indians would provide furs, and in exchange for the furs, they would get metal tools, metal implements, and fabric. The Indians didn't have fabrics. Now we talk about the settlements. Of course, it starts in Massachusetts, and the Pilgrims landed in 1620 at Plymouth. But in 1628 came a group of Puritans, which was a very different crowd, headed by John Endicott. And in 1630, an even larger group of Puritans came, led by John Winthrop. Now, these Puritans were truly religious fanatics, and they controlled everything, the church, the community, and individual lives, with an unbelievably strict set of rules. And anyone who didn't conform to those rules was considered a heretic and was either killed or severely punished or banished at the very least. And John Endicott, the original leader of those Puritans, was truly a sadist. When I read some of the punishments that he dealt out, some of them I wished I'd never read because I can't get them out of my head. But some of the minor punishments. A woman was whipped for smiling in church. An older man was whipped for holding a prayer meeting in his home when he found it difficult to get to the meeting house which John Endicott approved of. This was the kind of rules that these Puritans lived by. And let me read you a few things that were said about these people. What a God have the English, said a chief who rescued an aged wanderer despoiled and banished from the bay, who dealt so cruelly one with another about their God. Ninigret, the sachem of the Niantics, when asked to favor the preaching of Christianity among his people, he coolly replied that it would be better to preach it among the English till they brought forth its good fruits. William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania and of course a Quaker, said the Indians have some great men among them. I mean for wisdom, truth, and justice, and a code to which they adhered more faithfully than the white man did to his. And years later, Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote, we should thank God for giving us such ancestors, and thank him no less fervently that each generation removes us further from them in the march of time. Now I'd like to read you a paragraph from a book which was a great source of mine, The Town That Saved a State, Westerly. I have the good fortune to own a copy of this book because my father had it, but there are copies here at the library and at the Babcock Smith House. There is evidence that from the beginning, the English in Massachusetts determined on liquidating the great Indian leaders and subduing the tribes. Cotton Mather seriously maintained that the natives were the offspring of the father of all evil and obscene witches, bred here with intent to harass the saints. Therefore, by biblical authority, they were justified in exterminating the foul brood as soon as practicable and peopling the land with those made in their own image and likeness. They were never uncertain of their direction. No free Indians, no heretics was their goal. A great dream never fully realized. Great to-do was made about Indian cruelty. One might suppose it was the voice of civilized humanity speaking, but in comparison with the fiendish tortures inflicted on the continent and in England at that time, Indian savagery was the work of novices. Now, Connecticut was settled in Hartford and New Haven by Puritans from Massachusetts who had the same code of life. Stonington was settled in the 1640s, but not by Puritans from Massachusetts. Thomas Stanton, whom I know about, had a trading post on Pawcatuck River in Lower Pawcatuck by the late 1640s. And he originally came from England to Virginia and worked his way up the coast and ended up in Connecticut. And the man had an unusual linguistic skills, and he became one of the important interpreters of Indian languages for the colonies. Now, the first white men to show up in Rhode Island were actually these Dutch traders who came along the coast. And now the first settlements. Roger Williams was a very good man. He came over from England to Plymouth, and he was a kind and compassionate person, and he was a preacher. And he preached for several years in Salem and Plymouth. But the Puritans wanted nothing to do with this man because he was a great believer in freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of thought. So he was the antithesis of what they wanted in Massachusetts. And so he was actually officially banned with a document of banishment. So Roger Williams and a group of like-minded people went down to Seekonk, which of course is still in Massachusetts, but near the Narragansett Bay. And they started a little settlement there. They raised food, they started to build shelters and so forth. And someone came down and told Roger Williams that John Endicott was sending someone down to capture him and put him on a ship back to England. So Roger Williams got in a canoe, or his group got into canoes, went around Fox Point, up the Providence River, and landed in what is now Providence. And so that was the first settlement in Rhode Island. As we all know, Roger Williams settled Providence. In 1643, he got a charter from the king, at that point it was Charles I, saying that he was entitled to have a settlement in this area that became colonial Rhode Island. The second settlement here in Rhode Island was Portsmouth. A woman named Anne Hutchinson was about to be punished by John Endicott, not for something she said, but for something that he said she thought. That's the truth. That's the truth. He was going to punish her for what he said she thought. And so she and a group of like-minded people came down and settled Portsmouth. And that group included a man named John Clark, who is said to have been the most intelligent and interesting man in the 17th century in the New England colonies. And so they settled in Portsmouth. And, whoop, I got ahead of myself there. Yeah. And so then a group split off from the Portsmouth settlement and went down and settled Newport, which of course has a beautiful natural harbor. The next settler here that started a new settlement was a man also came down from Massachusetts. He was reputed to be a highly intelligent man, but a rather flamboyant personality. And he came down and bought land at Shawomet and started another colony. And in 1648, he named his colony Warwick after his sponsor, the Earl of Warwick. And in 1644, Providence, Portsmouth, and Newport united for common independence as the colony of Rhode Island and Providence plantations. And that was the first time that name, which still stands as the name of our state, was used. Now, in 1663, John Clark, that man I said was the most intelligent, interesting man in the colonies, and Roger Williams went to England to get more verification from the king, and now it was Charles II. And Roger Williams came home, but John Clark stayed until he got the charter. And one of the lines in that charter, that's the feedback from here, isn't it? One of the lines in that charter said that Rhode Island could be a state where no constraint could ever be put upon the human conscience and no limit to human thought. What is that? Anyway, and with that line in that charter, Rhode Island became the first colony in the world founded on the principle of freedom of thought and freedom of religion, a very important concept. And that charter cemented, that must be from this mic, that charter cemented the union of the four colonies of Providence, Warwick, Portsmouth, and Newport. And now we start to talk about Westerly. On March 21st of 1661, 80 members formed a syndicate over in Newport, in the colony of Newport, and they subscribed to a document called the Articles of Agreement, which they amended in July with acts and orders to purchase the Mesquamaket Purchase. The Mesquamaket Purchase was a piece of land that was 153.4 square miles. It was all of what is today Westerly, Charlestown, Hopkinton, and Richmond. And for the whole time period which I'm talking about today, that was Westerly. It was 1638 before Charleston separated from Westerly, and 1657 before Hopkinton did. So for a long time, Westerly was that whole huge area. The people in that syndicate divided the Mesquamaket Purchase into 6 shares valued at £7 each. Think about that, 153.4 square miles for 42 pounds. Quite a bargain. And they bought the land legally from an Indian named Sissoa. Sissoa was a man who had been a Pequot who survived the destruction of the Pequots back in 1637 and came over to Rhode Island. And he was a favorite of one of the sachems, Narragansett sachems. And that Miantinomi, the Narragansett sachem, actually gave this piece of land to Sissoa. And when Massachusetts questioned the legality of them buying this land from Sissoa, Miantinomi's widow actually signed a document, which I've seen a copy of, saying that she had witnessed Miantinomi giving this land to Sissoa, and therefore Sissoa had the legal right to sell this land to the people from the Newport Syndicate. Now, who first came to Westerly? Well, those of you who have toured the Babcock-Smith house, and if you haven't, you certainly should, know the story of John and Mary Babcock, which we always tell. The Babcock family had come down from Massachusetts. Everybody's running away from those Puritans. And they were in the Newport, they were part of the Newport colony. And young John Babcock was apprenticed to a Mr. Lawton in some business. I don't know what business. But he fell in love with the Lawton's daughter, Mary. And the Lawtons apparently did not approve of John Babcock as a match for their daughter, Mary, which is kind of funny when you think of all the offspring of John Babcock and what they've become. But anyway, John and Mary literally eloped. They got into a canoe and rowed over from Newport across the coast of Rhode Island, and they went up the Pawcatuck River. At that time, there was actually an opening about where the Musqueamica Club Beach Club is now, from the ocean into Little Narragansett Bay. So you didn't have to go all the way around Napatree Point over towards Stonington. But that opening has long since been closed by storms. So John and Mary landed. They came up to Mistuxet Cove, which is about where the Winnapaug Road goes off of the Watch Hill Road. And when they landed, the Indians greeted them and were good to them and helpful to them. And in the beginning, they actually lived in a little cave kind of up behind where Arthur Smith's house is. But John and Mary weren't really over here because of that syndicate that had bought the land from Sissoa. They were just eloping. But John's father was part of that syndicate. Now, the other 3 people who came here originally from that syndicate were 3 men named Tobias Saunders, Robert Burdick, and John Clark, Jr. I put these different spellings of Musqueamicut on the slide for you because when you read these documents from the 16th and 17th and even 18th century, there really weren't any rules of spelling, and the English had a hard time interpreting what the Indians were saying, and they just wrote whatever they thought they heard phonetically. So you get an enormous variety of spellings. Tobias Saunders was born in England in the 1620s in Buckinghamshire, England, which is very close to London. We know he was a soldier in the Life Guard of Foot for King Charles I. And he immigrated after his father's death in 1642. At that time in England, the law was primogeniture, in which the oldest son inherited the estate, which kept states from being divided as the generations went on. But it meant that the younger sons may have inherited money, but they never inherited land. That went to the oldest son. And Tobias Saunders was the second son, the 4th child, but the second son of his parents. So he probably paid for his passage to Massachusetts with the small inheritance he got from his father when he died. We know that he lived in Taunton originally, and he worked at the Saugus Iron Works in Massachusetts. And but like so many people in Massachusetts, he got out of the world of the Puritans and came down to Rhode Island, and he ended up in Newport. And we know from the records that he did purchase property in Newport in 1654, and he also joined the Seventh-day Baptist Church in Newport. And the Saunders family was Seventh-day Baptist Church. It was Seventh-day Baptist right up to my grandfather. In 1661, when this sale was made by Sasoa to the syndicate, Tobias acquired a 1/4 share of, and I told you there was 6 shares of the land, and he acquired 1/4 of a share. The arrest of Boston I'll talk to you about later. Now, during the King Philip's War, which we'll talk about later in 1675 and 6, Tobias was the only settler who stayed in Westerly. Everybody else went back to Newport because everybody was terrified of what was happening during the war. So, and we also know most of them came back again after the war, but Tobias was the only one who stayed in town as a liaison to Ninigret, who was a friend of his. And we know that Tobias eventually was the deputy to the General Assembly of Westerly for many, many terms. We know he married a woman named Mary Peckham, who was a great niece of the John Clark, who was the great colonist. And I found this list in an article of all the Westerly families who are descended from Tobias and Mary Saunders' children. They had 10 children. Most everybody had 10 children in those days. And all of these Westerly families are descended from his children, including me. My maiden name is Saunders, and I'm an 8th generation descendant of Tobias. The second man who came over was a man named Robert Burdick, and sometimes they spelled it Burdett, sometimes they spelled it Burdick. But he came from England directly to Newport in 1651. Must have heard about those Puritans, came straight from Rhode Island. And he came over and settled in Westerly in 1661. He did go back to Newport during the King Philip's War, but later returned to Westerly. And he, for 1680, 83, and 85, was a deputy to the General Court of Rhode Island. Tobias was to the General Assembly, and Robert Burdick was to the General Court. He married a woman named Ruth Hubbard, who was the first white child born in Agawam, Massachusetts, and he too was baptized into the Seventh-day Baptist Church in Newport in 1652. Now, there is some confusion in the records whether the third man who came over here was Joseph Clark or Joseph Clark Jr. I came to the conclusion it was Joseph Clark Jr. because in 1669, when the town was incorporated, we know from the records that he was the first town clerk. So I made that assumption. But he was born in Newport in 1642, so when he came here, he would have been 19 years old. And he died in Westerly in 1727. His father, Joseph Clark, was born in Suffolk, England in 1618 and had come also to the United States, or to the colonies. And he did eventually die in Westerly, so in 1694. So obviously at some point he did come to Westerly. We know that Joseph Clark Jr. was the first town clerk, and he was also a deputy of the Rhode Island Assembly for 6 terms. When you look at the dates, it would appear that Tobias Saunders and Joseph Clark Jr. alternated terms in the General Assembly. And if you think about it, this place was woods. Rhode Island was solid woods. It was very hard to get to the General Assembly meetings. You had to ride a horse through the woods to get to wherever the Assembly met. They used to meet in different places. They would meet in Providence, Warwick, Newport, etc. But it was a job to get there at that time. And we know that he married a woman named Bethia Hubbard in 1664. Now, in 1669, when Westerly was incorporated, there were 30 families here. I've listed 24 men here who were voters. The other 6 probably were indentured or something, and so they are not on the list of voters. But these are the people who were here at the time of incorporation in 1664. Notice this is the John Babcock that came over here with Mary on their elopement. These James Babcocks obviously weren't his son James. Mary and John's first child was named James, and he was the first white child born here in Westerly. But that's not him, because he would have been a toddler at this time. But you can see that a lot of members of the Babcock family had come here by now. There's also a Stanton here, and there's kind of an interesting story in that. In 1665, the Manassas Indians on Block Island had kidnapped a Narragansett princess for ransom. And the Narragansetts didn't have enough wampum to ransom her. And so they talked to their friend Thomas Stanton over in Lower Pawcatuck, who had the trading post, and because he traded with the Indians, he had quite a collection of wampum. And so he gave the Narragansetts enough wampum to ransom their princess. In return, the Narragansetts gave him a piece of that Narragansett purchase, that Misquamicut purchase, that's over in what is now Charlestown. The area, it starts approximately at Wilcox Tavern and goes over to the General Stanton Inn and includes all of Quannacontalk. And two of Thomas Stanton's sons eventually had farms in that area. In the 18th century, that was the Stanton Plantation, which was a very important enterprise in the 18th century, trading with Barbados and the other islands and so forth. But that's a later time period than I'm talking about. So I seem to keep pushing the buttons by mistake. I guess I'm done with that story. Okay, this is the story of the Massachusetts and Connecticut land claims. This was kind of bizarre. It starts with the Pawcatuck River, because in the very early days, the Pawcatuck River was called the Narragansett River. Now, Massachusetts Bay Colony had charters from the king, which granted them the land over to the east, over to Narragansett Bay. But they said that that really meant the Narragansett River, and therefore they owned Rhode Island. The people in Connecticut had a charter that made their eastern border the Pawcatuck River, then the Narragansett River. But they said that really meant Narragansett Bay, so they owned Rhode Island. Now, when I say they had land claims, I don't mean this was a dispute in the courts. People were coming over and burning people's houses down, arresting people, and killing people's animals. I mean, this was a horrible thing that went on for 60 years. And as soon as Saunders, Burdick, and Clark arrived here, Massachusetts sent a constable over from Connecticut to arrest them. They let Joseph Clark go, but they actually took Tobias Saunders and Robert Burdick only a couple of months after they arrived here to Boston, and they were in jail in Boston for 2 years. Their fine was 40 pounds each, which they certainly didn't have. And there was also a demand of 100 pounds for security. After 2 years, Roger Williams raised the money to bail these two men out, and they came back to Westerly. I don't know anything about the 100-pound security. I never saw anything about that in the reading I did. Now, after the King Philip's War, which we will talk about, in 1678, the Connecticut was claiming that they owned Westerly. And remember, Westerly was that whole area, the whole southeastern, southwestern portion of Rhode Island. And Samuel Gorton's crowd up in Warwick actually petitioned the Crown to grant that Westerly belonged to Rhode Island, and that actually happened. But in 1680, we know that the constables broke into the house of Joseph Clark and landed him in a Connecticut jail for a while. Again, they were saying that these people belonged to, that this land belonged to Connecticut. The Massachusetts Puritans claimed that they had in their minds a town they called Southertown, that was part of Stonington and part of Westerly. And they claimed that was really part of Massachusetts because they had killed off the Pequots. And so that became a huge problem. At one point, in 1860, in the 1680s, when James II was King of England, he decided that all the charters in New England, which they had worked so hard to obtain, were null and void, and he declared that all of the New England settlements, which is Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, were one colony called New England, and he sent a governor over here to govern it. And during that time, that governor renamed Westerly Haversham. And for 3 years, Westerly was called Haversham. And then in 1689, that got canceled, and it came back to being called Westerly. These land claims, which involved all this awful behavior by Massachusetts and Connecticut, didn't really get settled until George II became king. He became king in 1727, and in 1728, he finally decreed that Rhode Island was Rhode Island and put an end to all those land claims. But this was a problem that these people lived with for 60 years here, and it really was a problem. Now I'll talk about King Philip's War. Originally, the Wamsutta, that first son of Massasoit, the original sachem of the Wampanoags that I talked about at the time when the Pilgrims arrived. Oh, sorry. Thank you. When the Pilgrims arrived. After Massasoit died, Wamsutta became the sachem of the Wampanoags. And the Massachusetts Bay Colony was getting more and more paranoid, and they claimed that these people were trying to eliminate the colonists and so forth. And so they actually arrested Wamsutta for a while. He was in prison in Boston. And eventually they did release him, but he died on the trail on the way home. Now, Massachusetts said that he died of some disease he picked up in jail, but the Indians were completely convinced that they had poisoned him. What was happening in this period was that in the beginning, the Wampanoags were treated by the settlers in Massachusetts with some respect. But as time went on, they were treated with less and less respect. They had been buying bits of land from the Wampanoags over and over. And eventually they just started taking the land. And eventually they decided that the English were simply not to be trusted, that they were just a bunch of bad people, and they were not good neighbors, and they were a rough crowd. And so the Indians started getting very upset with these English settlements, which kept moving closer and closer and closer to their settlements. So after Wamsutta died, then his younger brother, Metacom, King Philip, became the sachem. And they accused Metacom of plotting with the French in Canada and the Dutch in New York as to overthrow the colonists, which really was not true. But they got more and more paranoid about it and started mistreating the Indians more and more. So eventually the Indians started attacking small settlements around Massachusetts. And the very first shot of King Philip's War was when a couple of Indians broke into an English house in Seekonk, and a young boy picked up his father's gun and shot an Indian. And that was the beginning of King Philip's War. And the Indians started raiding houses and burning food supplies, which of course were critical, and so forth. And at that point, all the Westerly settlers who had built up their places here hightailed it back to Newport, everybody except Tobias Saunders, who stayed to work with his friend, Ninigret. Then we come to the Great Swamp Fight. Because the Rhode Islanders were, to Massachusetts, heretics, total heretics. That's why they'd all come down here, because Massachusetts thought they were heretics. And because the Narragansett Indians had befriended Roger Williams and Samuel Gorton and Warwick, in fact, they were good friends and treated each other with mutual respect. Well, to Massachusetts, that meant that the Narragansetts were all heretics too. So they sent an army down to Rhode Island. At that time, the Narragansetts had a major fort on an island in the Great Swamp over in Kingston. And having it on an island offered a form of security. But on December 19th, 1675, the Great Swamp was frozen solid, which made it very easy for this army that came down from Massachusetts to access that fort. And they found a corner of the fort where they could gain access. And they went in and they started burning teepees and food supplies. Then they burned the whole fort. And the Indians, as many of them as could who fled, left behind 100 warriors who were dead and 50 who were wounded. And there were as many as 1,000 casualties among the women and children. The English lost 70 dead and about 150 wounded. And the Indians who escaped, most of them were caught and enslaved. And many of the Indians were sold down to the islands in the Caribbean. And Indians were sold for 32 shillings, which is the equivalent of 12 bushels of corn. That was how they were valued. Oh, nope, going back. Got another story to tell. King Philip's War didn't end with the Great Swamp Fight. King Philip and his band of warriors kept moving to avoid being caught. And they eventually ended up in Mohawk territory up in New York. But eventually, at the end of the year, and during this year, the Indians were continuing to burn settlements and so forth. During the duration of this war, every wooden building in Rhode Island was burned to the ground. Every wooden building. So, I lost my train of thought. Oh, so eventually King Philip, Metacom, decided he had it and he thought he was safe and he came home. And home to him was Mount Hope. And so he moved back to Mount Hope with his family, and someone knew where he was. And they reported that to John Endicott, and they sent down someone to kill King Philip. He was actually killed by an Indian who had been converted to Christianity and was fighting on the side of the Puritans. And he killed King Philip. King Philip's body was quartered, which was the standard punishment in England at that time for treason. And his head was put on a pike and was displayed in Plymouth, Massachusetts for 25 years after this war ended. Okay, now I will talk about the settlers. Now picture this. Those first people that came over here, this Mesquamaket Purchase, which they named Westerly, 153.4 square miles of dense woods and rocky as all get out, as we all know Westerly is. So every man, when he got his land, had to clear that land of all those trees, get rid of those boulders, and get rid of those rocks so that he could grow something and keep animals so that his family could survive. Oh, I keep hitting the buttons. I just put this thing down. And now, think about it. These people didn't have any bulldozers or chainsaws. This was handwork. It is said that the average person who came over here didn't really get to build a decent shelter for his family for 4 to 6 years because he spent 16 to 18 hours a day trying to clear this land, grow something, and fish. The Pawcatuck River at that time was said to be teeming with salmon. And Misquamicut does mean red fish. So I read in one article that the average farmer farmed with one hand and fished with the other. But these people had this tremendous class to clear this land. Now, these woods were full of wildcats and bears and wolves and foxes. So these had to be dealt with on a daily basis. In order to build a house, they needed supplies to build a house. And a lot of these supplies were sent forth from England. In fact, once the original settlers got here in the early part of the 1600s, they would all send word back to England that anybody coming needed to bring supplies for building. They particularly needed iron for nails. So they worked hard and eventually tried to build a house. But then they had to feed their families. Now, the things that they fed their families were, the Indians taught them a lot about what was edible, what fruits and vegetables and animals were edible. They taught them right away about oysters and clams. And the primary things they grew were beans and squash and pumpkins and corn. The Indians taught them about corn. Corn was from America. They didn't have that in England. And we all learned in grammar school that if you put a head of a fish under a stalk of corn, that it fertilized it and so forth. And the Indians taught them all that stuff. And pumpkins were really a base food for them. They imported oxen and horses and swine from England. They probably could get some supplies by that time from Portsmouth and Newport. But they couldn't buy anything from Massachusetts. No one in Massachusetts was allowed to sell anything to anyone in Rhode Island because they were all heretics. So they did import animals and try to raise animals. But it's some task to raise animals when you don't have good buildings and there are a lot of wolves and wildcats and bears around. So it was very difficult for them to raise sheep. And of course, sheep are so important not only for meat but for wool. And they had a very difficult time because of the wolves. It took a long time before they could build enclosures to lock the sheep in so that the wolves couldn't kill all their sheep. It was tough. Journey cakes. The Indians used to grind corn and make a little cake of it. And in this area, they put wild strawberries in it. In Massachusetts, they often put wild cranberries in it. And they formed those into a little cake which the Indians could put in a satchel attached to their waist. And when they traveled from one settlement to another, they could eat those for sustenance. And they called them journey cakes. And eventually, the English-speaking people changed that eventually to Johnny cakes. I want to tell you about the housewives' duties. This is quite a paragraph. This was the duties of a housewife in this era. It's hard to hold on to so many things at once. The housewives' duties were many: milking, gathering eggs and feeding the chickens, all household chores, weaving, spinning, cooking, and having children. Of course, they all had about 10 of those. There were many criteria set up for judging a woman in the early days in England, particularly for choosing a wife. Here is an amusing one by the English historian Markham in the 1600s. She must be chaste of thoughts, of stout courage, patient, diligent, witty and pleasant, wise in discourse, but not frequent therein. I would have had a hard time. And not sharp of tongue, of a cheerful disposition. Such a person will be treated with respect. Now, the author's note is, we would say that she would truly be a paragon and must have well deserved respect. I don't know why I keep hitting these buttons wrong, sorry. Okay, I'd like to finish with a couple of bits of humor. I love this little story. Here it is. Before the Revolution, the poorer class of European immigrants secured passage to this country through indenture, whereby they were bound to service for a term of years after their arrival. One of these redemptioners worked for a farmer in Westerly. After a season of willing service, the laborer intimated that he should like to continue the arrangement permanently. He seemed depressed by the idea that on the expiration of his contract, he would be obliged to toil for himself. Papers for life service were hence made out. On taking the pen to sign the instrument, the redemptioner hesitated, saying that he did not understand how the obligations of the old and new papers harmonized, since they overlapped in time. Explanations were in vain, so the two agreed to destroy the old paper. When the redemptioner raised his pen to sign the new paper, he again hesitated. The employer inquired the reason, since the laborer himself had proposed the life service. The latter replied, "I was thinking of some advice that my father once gave me. He gave me good counsel, and I only wished I had followed it more closely. He once said to me, 'My son, never sign your name to a paper of any kind.' As I have signed one paper but have just got rid of it, I think I shall not sign another. So, sir, I kindly bid you goodbye." The redemptioner walked away a free man, much to the chagrin of his erstwhile employer. Now that's Yankee ingenuity. I'll close with a funny little verse I found. It said, "Here's to New Haven and Hartford, to the turf where the Puritans trod. In the rest of mankind, little good did they find, but both were quite chummy with God." Now, yes?
You mentioned that all the wood buildings in Rhode Island have been burned during the King's War. That includes Providence and Newport.
It did. It even included Roger Williams' barn. Yeah, it really is true. And you know, in fact, a while ago, a group in Charlestown were trying to buy the General Stanton Inn, and they claimed that its derivation was 1665, but that's a wooden building. It couldn't be from 1665 because it would have been burned. Everything was burned, including Roger Williams' barn. Any more questions? Yes, Claudia? Oh, yes, thank you. The two sources that I found particularly useful were this book. I just read you the housewife story about it. This is a historical story of Charleston, Rhode Island from 1669 to 1976. It was done by the Historical Society in Charlestown. This book actually belonged to Ike Smith and is in the library at the Babcock Smith House. I found this very useful because since Charlestown was part of Westerly starting in 1661, they did start the story in 1661, so it's quite valuable. There's a similar book by the Hopkinton Historical Society, but they began at the time that they branched off in 1757. The other book which I mentioned is The Town That Saved the State, Westerly. This is an amazing book. It was written in the 1930s, and the woman who wrote it was a well-known national journalist. She worked for one of the major magazines, which were very important back in the days of Teddy Roosevelt and Howard Taft. Those magazines had a lot to do with the success of those two presidents. And she wasn't from here, but she came and spent a couple of years in North Stonington.
The library will be closing at 8 o'clock.
It's only 7:30. I've lost my train of thought.
The journalist.
Oh yeah, the journalist who wrote this book. And it starts in the very beginning, and it actually goes up through till I think she wrote it in 1934. It was eventually published by the Utter Company Press. But She has tremendous detail in here. And when I first gave this talk in 2016, I only read the first part of the book that had to do with the period I was dealing with because I didn't have time to read anything else. But then I finished the book later that year. There is the most wonderful stuff in here about the Industrial Revolution and inventors from here in Westerly who produced wonderfully important things. It's really an interesting history of the town of Westerly. Her name is Mary, I can't remember the middle name. Mary Agnes Best. And she was called Molly Best. But it truly is a wonderful story. And as I said, I'm lucky enough to own this because my dad had it. Another book I looked at was Wesley and Its Witnesses, written in the 1870s by Reverend Dennison. But it was more a history of the churches in Westerly than the kind of stuff I was interested in. So I didn't find it particularly useful, although I am lucky to also own a copy of that because that was my dad's. One of the things that surprised me was how much information I found online. I found two very interesting articles about King Philip's War online, and there was a whole book about the early history of Kent and Washington counties. The entire book is out there online, and it's a very old book, and there were 30 pages that dealt specifically with Westerly, which I grabbed and downloaded to my hard drive really quickly, because one of the problems I had is a couple of times I did a search for something online, and I found something, and then I could never find it again. So when I found that book, I literally, those 30 pages are still on the hard drive of my computer. Any more questions? Well, thank you very much.